Hello and welcome to another video from English Matters. Today we're going to look at a poem by Thomas Hardy called The Man He Killed. This poem of course features in the Edexcel conflict anthology. This works best of course if you have a hard copy of the poem which you annotate, underline and scribble on as we go through it. Also, I'd urge you to subscribe please, because I'll be uploading lots and lots of videos to do with all the poems from AQA, Edexcel and OCR over the next sort of few months or so. So if you could subscribe, do that now, that'd be really appreciated. So we think about the poem itself. I mean, the poem I think is set during the Boer War, a conflict that I think Hardy took issue with, although he did support or wrote poems in support of the First World War. If not poems, he certainly published articles. But it's an interesting poem, in structurally at least. I mean, if you look at the rhyme and the rhythm of it, it has a full rhyme scheme, which is, as I've said in my poems before, a full rhyme scheme tends to give the poem a kind of almost sing-song, ballad-like quality, almost like a lulling, well, you could almost say like a lullaby quality to it. So immediately we get an ironic conflation between the very lulling and reassuring full rhyme and sing-along quality to the poem, the song-like quality to the poem, and the subject matter of the poem. So there's instantly a kind of an ironic distancing between those two factors. Also, the regular metre and rhyme do lend a kind of a conversational feel to this poem. You know, it sort of sets the tone. Certainly we're thinking about certainly the form of the poem. It's actually a dramatic monologue. It's spoken. The whole thing is virtually use speech marks, so it's a tale that's kind of related, and that kind of instantly makes it. Obviously, it's somebody speaking, so that gives the whole thing a more of a personal feel. And it's an interesting poem because essentially it's a poem about trauma, and so it would make it an excellent pairing with, say, a poem like War Photographer, for example. So if we start with the actual poem itself, I mean, the poem is called The Man He Killed. I mean, the word killed as well, it's quite jarring and quite harsh, and it immediately creates a contrast between the very colloquial and almost convivial feel of the poem itself. So immediately you get that contrast, you know, that juxtaposition between the subject matter, the title, and the actual feel of the poem. But it's interesting. I mean, certainly the first stanza. The first stanza certainly makes it clear that the speaker, in many respects, you know, wishes he had met this man under different circumstances. You know, obviously, as readers, we do not know exactly what those circumstances were, but it does sound as if the speaker certainly has feelings of regret, or certainly is trying to come to terms with the action of what he has done. So the poem actually begins with a hypothetical, doesn't it? Had he and I but met. It's setting up a hypothetical situation that had I met this man in a bar, we could have had a drink together, may have been friends and things like that. But the hypothetical is designed to emphasise the humanity of the reveal the humanity of the poem of the two men who, had they met under different circumstances, would have reacted very differently to each other. And you know, also, had he and I met. I mean, the fact that he uses the pronoun he, he's not named, of course. The pronoun he gives it, instead of being personally naming someone, it gives it a universal feel to it. Had he and I met, it could be about any sort of two soldiers in many respects. So, had he and I but met by some old ancient inn. I mean, old ancient inn is obviously like a pub, and it gives it a kind of a pleasant sort of everyday sort of setting to it. We should have sat us down to wet, right many a nipperkin. Nipperkin is a type of container, really, which they probably would have drank ale from. We should have sat us down to wet many right. I mean, so obviously it's a use of lots of colloquialisms here, which reveals much about the speaker. That the speaker is just a kind of an ordinary sort of man, really, not an academic type. Then we get to stanza 2. But ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me and killed him in his place. Again, that sort of rhythm and rhyme gives it an almost lullaby, almost like a nursery rhyme sort of feel to it, as I've said before, which creates an irony between the subject matter and the form. But here, it's interesting, the second stanza, the word but has a jarring effect. And it's supposed to wrench us out of the hypothetical that is established in the first stanza. It sort of brings us back to reality. And here he talks about how the speaker had to stand face to face with this man and shoot him. And staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me. The speaker here sort of focuses on the man he shot, but he doesn't give us any insight into what he felt, having been the man to walk away. But one thing that is certain, the fact that the speaker has certainly become very reflective and contemplative after this experience, this trauma. So if we look at the stanza, as I've said, the book sort of takes us out of removes us from the hypothetical and plunges us in kind of a real life situation. But ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me and killed him in his place. He associates himself, and the repetition here of "and" I think is kind of, and staring face to face and killed him in his place is kind of, I think it sort of expresses a certain degree of empathy as that's developed as the poem goes on. But certainly the second stanza talks about the exchange between these two men, the exchange that ultimately led in one man dying and the other man walking away. It's interesting as we get on to the third stanza, because the third stanza is quite revealing in many respects. It's certainly what it does reveal is that the speaker perhaps doesn't really know why he shot the man. He says, I shot him dead because, and then we get the hyphen, because he was my foe. I don't think he really understands why he shot him, other than it was a situation where he felt he was forced to do so. But the pause is interesting here, I think. It's certainly made clear that the speaker is uncomfortable. Certainly he's uncomfortable with what he has done. He's trying to reason with himself to kind of convince himself that what he did was the right thing. The fact that he was at war was not reason enough here. He's trying to make sense of it. He's searching for a deeper reason, but the deeper reason seems to elude him. So that's kind of fits into the whole idea of psychological trauma that's going on here. So with the third stanza, we get the repetition of the word shot, which is mentioned in the second stanza, which emphasises the fact of what the outcome of this meeting was. But also, I think he repeats the word in the sense that he's trying to justify, I shot him dead because he was my foe. He's searching for a deeper reason that he just can't quite grasp. Just so, my foe, and of course foe is repeated as well. He keeps repeating these expressions. Repetition here is used in an attempt to sort of justify his actions. And at the end of the stanza you get that wonderful line, that's clear enough, although he thought. So you get that enjambment that links the third to the fourth stanza. Now, it's interesting, I mean, I read somewhere that the enjambment here is supposed to kind of represent a kind of looking back. And that's about the very nature of trauma. You kind of you're constantly reliving something. And because the language is unemotional and detached, I suppose we can infer from that as readers that it's a commentary in many respects on the very impersonal nature of war and the very impersonal nature of killing somebody in this context. So, list, of course, is to mean enlist, perhaps offhand like. It becomes very much like a conversation, offhand like, with the use of sort of colloquialisms and everyday language. And these dashes here are quite revealing because they break up the rhythm of the poem, and they talk about, they give it a fragmentary feel to it. But also, interestingly, is because it breaks up the meat and the rhythm of the poem, it certainly kind of shatters that rhythm, and it also suggests hesitation, I think, and doubt, and a sense of sort of psychologically sort of thrashing about and reaching for something. He thought he'd list perhaps offhand, like, just as I was out of work, had sold his trap. You can see what those hyphens and dashes there add to the feel of the poem and why they're there. So they kind of represent hesitation, doubt, and it gives it kind of a stuttering effect, which speaks directly of this man's desperately reaching for a reason why he shot him. The story he's telling about this man, or imagining about this man, is very much his own story in some respects. He himself enlisted because he didn't know what else to do, really. He did not go to war with the desire, I think, to kill. But now he has killed a man. He's finding it difficult to explain to himself, in many respects, the whole purpose behind it, or why he had to do it, other than, well, he was my foe. I was told he was my foe. And we get to the last stanza. I mean, I quite like this stanza. Yes, quaint and curious war is. There's a kind of a scathing sarcasm, a sardonic tone to that line. You shoot a fellow down. Again, you're using sort of very matter-of-fact, sort of everyday language for what is effectively killing somebody. You shoot a fellow down. You'd treat it if met or any bar is, or help to half a crown. Of course, it's interesting, really. There's almost a joke there that he's saying, you'd shoot somebody that had you met in any other sort of circumstances you would have bought a drink for. But it's kind of a joke that's infused with a sense of bitterness and sort of a scathing irony to it. So if we get the last stanza, one thing that's very interesting and certainly worth commenting on is the fact that war is rhymed with bar is. Obviously that's linking the two ideas together, the two possible scenarios in which you could meet somebody. The literal scenario with the hypothetical. It takes us back to the hypothetical that is established in the first stanza. But what is also very interesting, really, is that it structurally it links into that sort of theme of psychological trauma, because what it does is the bar mentioned here, it reminds us of the bar or the pub, ancient inn, mentioned in the first stanza. So that gives it a cyclical feel to it. And what this does is this immediately represents the thought process of the speaker. The fact that this story or this narrative is going round and round and round in his head, which is very much reminiscent of the nature of psychological trauma. Also, what is interesting, of course, is the empathy that the speaker has with the man he shot. He kind of imagines him as himself. I mean, he says in the penultimate stanza, of course, just as he was just like me. He was out of work, sold his traps, no other reason why. He was just somebody that just had to enlist, really, and it just came down to luck that he was the man who survived, although he is the man that seems to be plagued with this sort of guilt for the rest of his life. Anyway, I hope you've got something out of that. I shall be soon uploading another video about another poem. Please click like and subscribe, but more importantly, please do keep studying.